Welcome to the Remedify Coaching Program podcast. Today, we are undertaking a really fascinating and I think an intensely focused deep dive.
Absolutely. We've got a specialized collection of sources here.
They analyze some very deep internal theological debates within Islam.
That's right. Specifically, we're looking at detailed apologetic material, the kind of stuff that really gets into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, and it explores the status, the placement, and, the ultimate destiny of two absolute pivotal prophetic figures, Jesus, who's known as Isa, and of course, the Prophet Muhammad.
And this is really a dive into areas of textual friction.
Textual friction, I like that term. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's where the consistency within the foundational scripture, so we're talking about the Quran and the authenticated traditions, the Hadith, is, it's tested. It's put under some really intense scrutiny.
So the sources we have, they're excerpts from a highly detailed, maybe even a comparative discussion.
Exactly. And it's all designed to uncover these points of tension that pop up when you interpret these texts alongside one another, especially on, the most sensitive topics imaginable, prophetic status and destiny.
So our mission today is clarity. That's what we're aiming for.
It has to be.
We're going to try to extract the core scriptural and historical arguments that are presented in this material. We want to understand precisely what these points of tension are.
And this whole deep dive, it's designed to give you, the listener, a thorough, and we have to stress, a neutral understanding of these really complex theological comparisons.
And we're basing it entirely on the provided documentation. We're not adding anything, just analyzing what's there.
Right. And the central tension, the hook that really pulls us into this material, it's the juxtaposition of these two figures.
It's a stark contrast.
It is. We're going to be unpacking arguments that suggest Jesus is right now in a state of perfect peace and exaltation with God.
And then at the same time, we're going to examine scriptural claims that seem to express some serious, very public uncertainty about the fate of the Prophet Muhammad.
Right up to the very moment of his death. It's a dive into textual consistency and also ritual history.
It really is an exercise in high-stakes textual analysis. And because this source material is so, it's so rapid-fire and dense, we're going to organize these complex interpretations into 3 digestible themes.
Good idea.
So we'll start with the exalted status of Jesus and this profound question of why a formula of peace would even be necessary for a figure who is supposedly already confirmed to be with the divine.
To begin, we really have to establish the precise location and spiritual status of Jesus, at least according to the interpretations that are presented in our source material.
Okay.
And this all starts with a crucial Quranic citation and the accepted understanding of Islamic cosmology that frames that verse.
All right, let's unpack this slowly then, because it sounds like the logical deduction here depends completely on that cosmological premise.
It does.
So the core question the source material is posing is, where exactly is Jesus, Isa, located according to the Quran?
Yes. And the reference is Quran chapter 4, verse 158, which is often interpreted to mean that God raised Jesus up to himself.
Okay, that's our starting point. Raised up to himself.
Right. But before we even get to the verse, we need to detail what the sources stipulate about the established Islamic cosmology. Because without that, the phrase doesn't have the same weight.
Okay, so what's the cosmology?
These documents argue that Allah is described in the Quran as being located not just in heaven, but above the 7 heavens. And what's more, that Allah is established on the throne.
So we have a defined, exalted, physical location for the divine. Wait, hang on.
Yes.
Doesn't the common interpretation sometimes argue that being raised up to himself is purely spiritual? Not a physical location. How do these sources address that pushback?
That is a crucial distinction and a very common question. The sources we're examining, they reject the purely spiritual interpretation in this context. They argue that when a physical body is removed from the earth and the destination is explicitly stated as up to himself, the location has to be understood as literal, or at least physically exalted.
I see.
If it were purely spiritual, the term raised up would lose its narrative force.
So if you combine the premises, Allah is above the 7 heavens, on the throne, and the explicit assertion that Allah took Jesus to herself, the logical implication that's derived by the source material is that Jesus is currently with Allah on the throne.
That's the conclusion they draw.
That interpretation, that establishes Jesus in a maximally exalted and specific state. That is a position of undeniable proximity and favor.
Indeed. And the implication of being in this position physically with the Almighty is one of perfect realized peace.
Okay.
And this leads directly to the core challenge posed in the material.
Which is?
If Jesus is with Allah on the throne, how could he possibly be in a state other than perfect peace? He's reached the highest possible station of tranquility and fulfillment.
And here is where the textual analysis meets ritual practice.
Exactly.
The sources then raise a direct, and I have to say, a very provocative question about the common Muslim invocation. Why do Muslims continue to use the prayer or invocation, peace be upon him, when referring to Jesus?
The argument hinges on redundancy.
Right. Does Jesus need your peace if he's already in such a perfect, exalted state, seated, according to this interpretation, with God?
This is a powerful point of internal critique. The challenge is built on the foundation that any additional prayer for peace seems to imply a deficiency.
A lack of total tranquility, or maybe a potential future danger.
Precisely. If Jesus is with Allah, he is, by definition, in the best possible state, a state of complete and utter tranquility, arguably the highest form of peace attainable.
So the invocation, from this viewpoint, almost seems to insult the perfection of his current status.
That is the thrust of the argument.
Now let's move from that logical deduction about his physical and spiritual location to a textual examination of the ritual practice itself. The source material takes this analysis even further by challenging whether this invocation, peace be upon him, is even scripturally commanded in the first place for Jesus.
This is a key point. The analysis in these documents stresses that no such normative command exists for Jesus.
What do you mean by normative command?
Well, there's no command comparable to the explicit instruction found in the Quran to invoke blessings upon Muhammad. For Jesus, the text referred to the peace formula. You see it in Quran 19.33, for example, but they say it's descriptive and contextual.
Descriptive, not prescriptive.
Exactly. They describe what happened to Jesus or what he stated at birth. They are not ritual instructions commanding believers to repeat the formula in prayer or devotion.
This textual absence is really significant, and it leads to a common theological counter-argument that's used to justify the practice today, which the source material dismisses quite forcefully.
It calls it pathetic logic.
Pathetic logic. What exactly is that counter-argument they're dismissing?
So the counter-argument is based on a concept of prophetic equivalence and ritual symmetry. The thinking goes, since the Quran instructs believers to confer blessings on Prophet Muhammad, and since Jesus is undeniably a prophet as well, then, the logic suggests that a similar blessing or peace invocation should automatically be conferred upon Jesus.
Just out of general respect for his status in the prophetic line.
Right. But the source material finds this totally insufficient.
And brands it pathetic logic. So why is that equivalence principle not enough in this context?
Because, according to these very same sources, the argument fails to account for the crucial distinction in need and status.
There's that word again. Need.
Yes. The reason why Muhammad eats prayers, as we'll get into shortly, is because of his stated uncertainty about his own destiny. Jesus, on the other hand, is argued to be already confirmed as being with Allah on the throne.
So the justification for the ritual practice can't just be based on he was a prophet.
No. It has to be based on the specific acknowledged need of the prophet in question. And Jesus, in his exalted state, is argued to possess no such need.
That confirms the logical structure then. The sources are demanding a specific textual or status-based necessity for the invocation, which they argue is completely lacking in Jesus' case.
And this is where we shift our focus.
Mm-hmm.
We move from the internal logic of the Quranic text to the historical evolution of the ritual.
Okay, so if the formula wasn't explicitly mandated in the earliest text, we need to understand why and how it emerged.
Precisely. This requires us to look at the early period, say the first century of the Hijri calendar, when Islam was really consolidating its identity.
And what was the primary purpose of mentioning Jesus during that founding period?
At that time, the early Muslim community was, they were focused on consolidating the revelation, transmitting the Quran, and establishing the basic norms of worship and law.
So Jesus' role in that context was what?
He was primarily a narrative figure. He was invoked in specific passages to affirm God's oneness, to confirm the lineage of prophetic revelation, and very importantly, to correct what were seen as theological deviations.
Specifically the worship of Jesus among earlier communities.
Exactly. He was a foundational piece in the new community's self-understanding.
So he served an internal function, really, confirming the validity and consistency of God's message.
That's a good way to put it. And the crucial historical context here is geography.
How so?
During this initial phase, Islam had not yet entered into sustained, daily coexistes with the powerful, long-established Trinitarian Christian centers of the Levant and Egypt.
So the practical necessity of defining Jesus's precise theological boundary against deep-rooted Christian worship, it just wasn't a daily polemical challenge yet.
It wasn't. And the absence of a fixed, explicit liturgical formula for Jesus in the Quran is seen by these sources as a direct reflection of that historical reality.
That's a fascinating layer of complexity, because if the practice were truly normative and identity-defining during the prophet's lifetime, the analysis suggests it would have, well, it almost certainly would have left an early, clear textual trace.
Which it didn't.
So when does the formula become necessary?
The situation shifted dramatically when Islam expanded politically into long-established Christian lands. We're talking Syria, Judea, Egypt, Iraq.
And in these places, Muslims encountered communities that had been practicing Trinitarian liturgy for centuries.
And they were openly worshiping Jesus as Lord and Son of God, not just as a prophet.
That sustained daily contact would have to fundamentally transform Jesus's role in Islamic discourse. He moves from being a helpful narrative figure to becoming
the point of direct theological confrontation.
Right.
Islam now faced an imperative. How do you reject the established Christian Christology, the idea of Jesus as Lord and Son of God, while still maintaining the necessary respect for him as a prophet affirmed by the Quran?
They needed a functional mechanism, something to draw a clear line in the sand.
And that's where the formula comes in. So the formula, Ali, peace be upon him, it functions as a theological tool.
It's essentially a historical and geopolitical artifact that emerged to meet this new historical pressure.
That is the analytical perspective presented in the sources. The expression is best understood as a symbolic tool that allows Islam to communicate two messages simultaneously in a polemical environment.
What are the two messages?
First, it signals that Jesus is honored as a true prophet, deserving of great respect. But second, and this is crucial, it establishes and maintains strict theological boundaries.
To ensure that this honor doesn't inadvertently cross the line into divine veneration.
Which is seen as the essence of shirk, or polytheism.
It's a boundary-setting mechanism. It defines Islamic reverence against Christian worship, so that's the key takeaway for you, the learner. The source material argues that this formula emerges from the pressures of theological debate, not from an explicit original textual mandate in the Quran or a necessity based on Jesus's already exalted status. So we've established the argument for Jesus's perfect peace and the historical context of his invocation. That contrast now naturally leads us to the other side of the ledger.
Right. The scriptural arguments regarding Prophet Muhammad's own fate.
And why, in the view of our source material, his need for prayer is, in fact, textually grounded.
And this contrast, it really hinges on this idea of explicit certainty versus public vulnerability.
And it starts with a specific Quranic instruction given to Muhammad himself.
Yes, found in chapter 46, verse 9. This verse is cited as direct evidence that Muhammad publicly declared a lack of certainty regarding his own ultimate destiny.
Okay, let's focus on the wording of that quote, because the source material really emphasizes that this must be understood as a public command to the prophet himself.
It's what he's told to say.
So Muhammad is commanded to say, "I am not the first messenger ever sent, nor do I know what will happen to me or you. I only follow what is revealed to me, and I am only sent with a clear warning."
The source material focuses intently on that phrase. Nor do I know what will happen to me or you.
This is Muhammad's public, scripturally commanded declaration that he does not know what Allah will ultimately do with him, the messenger, or with his followers.
This is the moment of crucial disparity.
But wait, if the text requires the prophet himself to admit to this kind of future uncertainty, why wouldn't that undermine his mission?
Well, the sources don't argue it undermines the mission itself. The mission is the clear warning and the transmission of revelation.
Okay.
However, they argue it fundamentally affects his post-mortal status. It means that, unlike Jesus, who is argued to be already confirmed with Allah on the throne,
Right.
Muhammad explicitly places himself and his followers under the cloud of an unknown future judgment.
And this uncertainty, which is derived directly from the Quran, is then used to reinforce the necessity of the invocation used for Muhammad.
Exactly.
So the argument is that Muhammad needs your prayers because of this uncertain future, whereas Jesus is already with Allah in a confirmed state of peace.
It creates a structural disparity that's rooted directly in the scripture itself. If the prophet himself admits uncertainty about his post-mortal status, it provides a sound and necessary rationale for the community to constantly pray for his welfare, his forgiveness, and his deliverance in the future.
But if Jesus is already delivered and seated with God, the rationale for that constant peace invocation just evaporates.
According to this line of reasoning, yes.
Now, the sources take this vulnerability even further. They move to another chapter, 19, verses 71 and 72, to present evidence of a potentially universal uncertainty.
An uncertainty that applies not just to common people, but potentially to the prophets as well.
And this passage is, it's highly controversial and requires some really precise textual analysis.
Absolutely. This passage describes what is often translated as a requirement for everyone to pass over hell.
So the verse 19.71 states, "There's none of you who will not pass over at hell."
And the entire theological debate, according to these sources, hinges on the precise meaning of that phrase, pass over.
Right. I think the most common traditional interpretation, which the source material does address, is that this refers to crossing the Sirat,
The bridge.
a bridge said to be finer than a hair and sharper than a sword, stretched over the gulf of hell. The righteous cross safely while the wicked fall in.
That is the widely accepted understanding, yes. However, the analysis in these documents argues strongly against that interpretation being the primary meaning,
And why is that?
based purely on the subsequent verse. The argument is that Passover implies entrance, not just crossing above,
And the proof, according to the sources, lies in the next verse, 19.72.
which says, "Then we will deliver those who are devout, leaving the wrongdoers there on their loose."
Okay, so how does that prove entrance?
The logical flow presented is, frankly, devastating to the bridge analogy. If Passover simply meant crossing the Sirat bridge above hell, the wrongdoers would not subsequently end up there on their loose inside the fire, nor would the devout need to be delivered or taken out.
Ah, I see. The very act of deliverance, naja, in Arabic, meaning to rescue or take out.
It logically necessitates prior entrance. If the devout were merely crossing safely on a bridge, there would be no need for God to deliver them. They wouldn't be in any danger to begin with.
So based on this tight reading of the verbs, the logical conclusion drawn by this interpretation is, it's stark.
It is.
It means everyone, the righteous and the wicked, must, at least temporarily, enter hell.
And this would include all prophets, including Muhammad. As the prior verse states, "There's none of you who will not pass over it." It's a universal address.
So only the God-fearing are delivered or taken out while the wrongdoers stay behind.
The implication is massive. It suggests a temporary but required entrance into hell for potentially every single soul, regardless of their piety.
And that aligns with Muhammad's prior confession of uncertainty about his fate.
It does. He may be delivered, but he is not exempt from the entrance.
And this brings us right back to the central conflict with Jesus' status.
Right.
If this universal requirement to enter hell is true, how could Jesus, who is already confirmed to be with Allah on the throne, possibly enter hell?
This is highlighted as a genuine textual contradiction. The only way for Jesus to be subject to that mandate, if it means universal entrance, while maintaining his confirmed position, is if Allah himself is located in hell.
A notion the document swiftly dismisses as impossible within Islamic orthodoxy.
Of course. So the two verses, when read literally and universally, create what appears to be an irreconcilable contradiction regarding the ultimate fate of Jesus versus the universal destiny of all humanity.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. It really highlights how important deep textual study is.
It really is. The ability to engage with foundational texts at this level of critical detail is crucial for true understanding. It allows you to see the sources and the underlying logic, not just the tradition that's built upon them.
Indeed. And, speaking of that, before we move into the final and perhaps most explosive tension concerning the Prophet Muhammad's death, we should probably pause.
Okay.
If grappling with these foundational texts is what truly excites you, then we have a resource that's designed specifically for this kind of deep study and critical analysis.
It's a fantastic opportunity.
So are you looking for a thorough, free education that lets you engage deeply with foundational texts at this level of scholarly rigor? Then we encourage you to. Get free Bible College online in your inbox, Tyrannus Hall Bible College, THBC.
And there's no need to travel hundreds of miles to go to college. All you need is your phone and an internet connection.
You can start today. Tell all your friends. This is a great opportunity to explore these very foundational texts further at your own pace and convenience. You can visit https://shop.beacons.aak 2020 Tyrannus Hall Bible College.
Now let's bring the focus back to the sources. We've explored the uncertain future of the Prophet Muhammad, But the next section turns our attention to the actual circumstances of his death.
And the critical theological tension that emerges when examining the language used to describe his final moments. All right, this section delves into what the source material presents as the most consequential textual juxtaposition.
It places a severe divine warning against prophetic fabrication directly against an authenticated account of the Prophet Muhammad's death.
And it examines the precise language used in both instances.
The central tension here is a problem of identical vocabulary. The same words are used in two opposing contexts, one of severe punishment and one of physical demise.
So let's begin with the divine threat itself. It's found in the Quran, chapter 69, verses 44 to 47.
This passage outlines God's specific and fatal punishment for any messenger who fabricates revelation in his name.
And what is the nature of this threat? It sounds serious.
It's a clear, unambiguous divine warning. The threat is specific, it's brutal, and it's unresistible.
Okay.
The verses state that had the messenger made up something in our name, God would suddenly seize him by his right hand and then sever his awatin.
And the consequence is certain death.
Certain death. And the text emphasizes that none can shield him from this swift divine punishment.
Okay, let's focus intensely on that term, al-watan. The source material emphasizes that this is not a general term for illness or fever or just pain.
That's absolutely vital. In classical Arabic, al-watan refers specifically to a vital life-sustaining vessel.
So the aorta.
The aorta, yes.
Yeah.
The primary artery branching from the heart. When this vessel is severed, death is certain and unavoidable.
And the sources stress that the Quran itself has fixed the meaning of al-watan.
Yes, within the context of fatal divine judgment against a fraudulent prophet. It is the language of a specifically reserved, unchallengeable punishment.
So, to be clear, if a prophet is fabricating revelation, God's fixed, unresistible punishment is to seize him and cut this vital vessel, resulting in instant or certain death. That is the established meaning and context of those verses.
That is the consequence of ultimate theological failure, as laid out in the Quran. And now we introduce the countertext, the text that forces the tension.
Which is the authenticated account of Muhammad's death.
Yes, found predominantly in Sahih Bukhari and other major Hadith collections. This is the tradition that defines the Prophet's final hours.
And the Hadith recounts the story of Muhammad's death, which occurred years after an incident at a place called Khaybar.
Right. This is where a Jewish woman fed him a poisoned piece of lamb. He survived the initial ingestion, but the poison's effects were said to have lingered in his body for years, causing chronic illness.
So the poison was slow-acting.
Very slow-acting, and the Prophet ultimately succumbed to its long-term effects. The critical moment, however, is what's recorded as he lay dying.
It's his conversation with his wife, Aisha.
Yes, he's detailing the nature of his final pain. And he tells her, "I still feel the pain caused by the food I ate at Khaybar, and at this time I feel as if my aorta is being cut from that poison."
Wait a second, let me make sure I'm following that. The Hadith uses the identical term al-watan, the cutting of the aorta,
Yes.
that the Quran uses as the specific, fixed, fatal threat against a false prophet who fabricates revelation.
This is where the textual friction truly appears.
It seems unavoidable.
It is. The tension is profound because it creates an almost word-for-word alignment between the description of the punishment specifically reserved for fabrication in the Quran and the specific description the Prophet Muhammad used for his own cause of death in the Hadith.
So the source material is arguing that the Prophet Muhammad died using the very language that the Quran reserved for someone condemned as a liar by God.
That is the severe problem of textual consistency that they highlight.
Because if the Quran has fixed the meaning of that language to signify a specific, unresistible divine judgment, and the authentic Hadith uses that precise language to describe the Prophet's death, a significant internal conflict emerges that goes right to the heart of his prophetic authentication.
We have to delve into the logical problem this creates. Later theology must have tried to harmonize this.
Of course.
For instance, some argue that because the poison didn't kill him immediately, it was prolonged death years later, the threat in chapter 69 wasn't technically executed because the punishment should have been immediate.
Right. But the source material, it rejects this harmonization.
It doesn't see that as a solution.
No, the analysis argues that this prolonged death does not resolve the difficulty. It intensifies the textual tension.
It intensifies it. Because the Quran describes a punishment that cannot be resisted and works itself out fully. None of you could have shielded him from us. A slow death where the poison lingers for years and eventually works its way to the al-Watin to cause the described agony.
Is arguably even closer to the logic of an unresistible, preordained divine judgment than a swift, immediate death?
Exactly. It suggests the punishment was predetermined and working itself out over time rather than a simple, unconnected accident.
It's staggering to think that two foundational texts could hinge on the precise meaning of a single word like al-Watin.
It is.
So these theological attempts to describe his death as martyrdom or a divine test or a noble destiny, these are seen by the sources as later external additions.
Theological necessities created by tradition to resolve the dissonance that the earliest raw texts explicitly create.
The methodological question for the learner is unavoidable then, and the sources stress its gravity.
Yes. If death by poison, causing the sensation of the al-Watin being severed, is an honor or martyrdom, why does the Quran use identical language as the specific fatal threat against a prophet who is fabricating revelation?
And the documents frame this by pointing out that no passage associates al-Watin with honor or a test.
It is consistently and exclusively linked to fatal judgment.
This leaves Islamic tradition, based on these sources, in a very difficult position regarding its internal foundations. What are the options here? The source analysis presents three unavoidable ones.
Right. The sources argue that to maintain consistency, one has to choose one of these three paths.
Okay, what's the first?
First, the rejection of the Hadith. This means the authenticated tradition from Sahih Bukhari, the one which describes the prophet's final moments using the term al-Watin. It has to be discarded to protect the prophet's honor and the integrity of the Quranic warning.
So throughout the Hadith, what's the second option?
The second is the weakening of the Quranic meaning of al-Watin. This path asserts that the verses in chapter 69 don't truly mean fatal divine judgment by severing the aorta, but merely intense physical suffering.
But that would seem to undermine the seriousness of the Quran's warning to its own messenger.
It would. And the third option?
The third is the acknowledgement of a serious unresolved tension. This option just admits that two foundational texts, the Quran and the authenticated Hadith, are logically incompatible on this most sensitive subject.
The prophetic seal's final, authenticated judgment.
So you just accept the tension as an unavoidable internal complexity.
Exactly. This deep dive has really shown the enormous stakes of precise textual analysis when dealing with sacred texts. It highlights how a single term and its context can reveal profound internal tensions across the entire spectrum of prophetic history and destiny. So to synthesize this profound deep dive, we began by noting the exalted, perfectly peaceful status of Jesus, or Isa, according to the physical interpretation of Quran 4.158.
Placing him with Allah on the throne.
Right. We then contrasted this with the scriptural declaration by Muhammad in Quran 46.9 of his own uncertainty regarding his ultimate destiny.
A really stark difference.
And that disparity was then reinforced by Quran 19.7172, which, when you analyze it based on the logic of deliverance, suggests a universal entrance into hell.
Which creates a direct logical conflict with Jesus's confirmed peaceful status.
And most dramatically, we explored this profound textual tension concerning the Prophet Muhammad's death.
The specific language of fatal divine judgment for fabrication, the severing of the al-Watin,
appears word for word in an authenticated account of the Prophet Muhammad's final moments due to that lingering poison.
which forces a confrontation that theologians have to navigate by either modifying the meaning of the Hadith or the meaning of the Quran, or just acknowledging a fundamental textual irreconcilability.
And the goal of this deep dive is always to understand the structure of these beliefs, to trace the logical pathways and the internal complexities that drive these major apologetic debates.
We've shown how theological boundaries emerge and shift, like the rise of the peace be upon him formula for Jesus as a kind of geopolitical boundary marker.
And how minute textual details can lead to enormous, unavoidable logical problems within what's meant to be a unified theological system.
This whole journey through the sources really illustrates the powerful function of critical textual analysis and the dynamic historical development of ritual practice in the face of conflict.
So let's end with a final provocative thought for you, the learner. We've seen how theological boundaries can shift when a faith expands into new territory, forcing the creation of boundary markers like that PBUH formula.
Right.
Now, consider what happens when these classical scriptural and historical tensions, like the al-Watin conflict, are confronted by modern global communication methods. Does the need to reconcile this deep textual tension become more or less urgent in the 21st century, when these discrepancies can be shared, analyzed, and disseminated instantly across the globe?
That is certainly something to ponder long after this deep dive concludes. And for those interested in exploring these foundational texts further and engaging with them at this level of critical detail, we want to remind you of that great resource where you can undertake your own deep dive.
Definitely.
We encourage you to get free Bible College online in your inbox. Tyrannus Hall Bible College, THBC. There's no need to travel hundreds of miles to go to college. All you need is your phone and an internet connection.
You can start today. Tell all your friends. You can begin your personal study right now.
Visit https://shop.beacons.aakk2020 to Ranish Hall Bible College.
Thank you for joining us for this incredibly deep dive into the textual challenges within Islamic theology.
We'll see you next time.